All right, so Module 11, Cultural and Social Justice Issues. So there's a lot of different subject areas within this module, I guess I could say. So if we're looking at the PowerPoint and looking at like slide 2 and the topics that we're covering. So I wanted to break it down for you guys so you understood just what you should be maybe looking for. So when I'm talking about the social justice part of this module, I've got this little overview lecture, and then there's an ableism video that I encourage you to watch. And we're thinking about multicultural counseling. I've got just some lecture notes that provide a nice little overview of certain things to consider when working with different populations. And then there's some additional readings, some journal articles that speak to the employment of return to work outcomes and how they differ for veterans who are African American versus veterans who are white. And that's a really interesting article that I encourage you guys to read. But so there's the multicultural counseling aspect of this module is basically all in reading. And then the section on women with disabilities, which is kind of like a special topics issue. And we're thinking about kind of the broader umbrella of social justice issues. So I'm going to talk about women with disabilities and how counseling might look for women with disabilities, things to consider, and how that all applies to social justice and advocacy. And then again, there's some readings as well. So to get started with social justice. So what in the world do we mean when we say social justice? There's not one definition of social justice that the entire profession of counseling has said, yep, we all 100% agree on this particular definition. For me, I like to think of social justice as a separate construct from multiculturalism, because social justice, in my view, really encompasses the full width and breadth and depth of who people are, who they are at their core. It is not just limited to race or ethnicity, although it does encompass that as well. But we're thinking about all the other isms that are out there. And when we're approaching our work from a social justice perspective, one of the underlying themes in the work that we do is to eliminate systematic oppression, racism, to address all levels of marginalization of different populations of people. And so I offered what, and really this came from my dissertation work, but how I frame social justice, the definition of social justice. So we are acknowledging systematic societal inequities, we're acknowledging what those are, and oppression, and we're also working toward equity and justice with and for all individuals who come from marginalized populations and groups. And the with and for is really important when we're thinking about social justice, because a lot of the ways that individuals have become oppressed and become marginalized is because people in higher powers and authority decided that they thought they knew what was best for that group of individuals. And so they were working, quote unquote, on behalf of the individual from that marginalized group without actually working with that person or that group of individuals. And so if we're not working with and for our clients who come from marginalized populations, then we really could be doing a very large disservice to the overall goal of promoting social justice, both in counseling and in the world. So I encourage you to think about what social justice means to you. What is it, if you think of social justice, is it more advocacy based? Is it more understanding, the viewpoint of the clients that we're working with? Is it working with one population versus another? What does social justice look like to you? And start exploring that, as you continue to work towards your career goal here. We have talked ad nauseum about worldview, I feel like, but I'm going to keep doing it because it is so important that we really understand worldview. And I'd like to take a different spin on it every time, but it's kind of the same thing regardless of the class. But here I'm thinking about your introduction to the profession and introduction to worldview. It's important to remember that the construction of worldview begins in childhood, and it begins oftentimes before a child is before a child could ever even perceive that this is what's happening, that their worldview is being shaped by society. And this comes through the socialization of gender norms, through racial inequities and what those look like. It comes through social class, and all of these things are out of the control of a child. So, you know, I could do my best as a parent to purchase gender neutral clothing for my daughter and my son. I guess I've got 2 kids now, and it goes both ways. I can purchase toys that you know, are not biased one way or the other. But the real big issue here is that if you walk into Target, what you're going to see is that boys' toys are blue, girls' toys are pink, and girls' clothes are pink, and boy clothes are blue, and boy clothes have rockets and dinosaurs and things about being a leader printed on their shirts and being superheroes and having superpowers. And girls' clothes from infancy, you can find preemie clothing that says like, I'm a cutie, and you know, everybody loves me, and nicey nice this and this, and princesses and princes rescuing them. And it's our society. It's our society. It's getting better. You know, there are companies out there that do cross the gender lines for sure. And I can definitely find a pink shirt that says science on it now. But you have to search for it. And regardless of what we try to do as caregivers with our children, whatever role you might be in, aunt, uncle, whatever, there's a socialization aspect, and that is just gender. So if we want to think about socialization and racial inequity and social class, I mean, you're thinking about the opportunities that are afforded to people in higher social classes versus lower social classes. I mean, I can even think of when I lived in the South, how educational systems, even from daycares on, I mean, in the earliest forms, you know, there were daycares that were predominantly African American, and there were daycares that were predominantly white. And to a very real degree, segregation still exists down in the South. And it's systematic. It's because of where people live. It's because of social class. It's because of where the wealthy live versus those that are poor. It's where the job base is and the types of careers that people get in. And I could go on and on and on about this, but I know that I've already spent 7 minutes talking about it. So if we think about our role as counselors, and this is the take home with worldview, and it kind of leads into where I'm going with like our values and beliefs. We have to understand that in the counseling relationship, we are at a privileged status by the nature of where we're coming from. Regardless of our personal gender, our client's gender, our racial identity, our sexual identity versus our client's racial and sexual identity, regardless of all of that, we are at a privileged status because we have master's degrees or higher, we have certifications, we have education, and historically, the counselor has been seen as the expert. So even in our work, and if we're taking theoretical orientations that are working to get us on the same level as our client and put our client back in the driver's seat, because of how society has perceived therapists and psychotherapists for all these years, there's a power differential within that counseling relationship. So we have to be both knowledgeable and aware of these power differentials, be aware of our racial biases, not racial biases, all of our biases, and then also understand how this translates into behavior. Because studies and research have found that lots of counselors out there understand who they are, they understand their worldview, they've examined it, they've talked about their biases, but when it comes down to observing their behavior in a counseling session, it's not translated through. And so when we have identified our values, beliefs, and biases, we have to look at our actual behavior. We have to think about our verbal communication, the inner dialogue we're having with ourselves, and we have to think of communication as being at the core of it, interpersonal communication. And that's a result of our society. We live in America. Self-talk, inner dialogue, all of that isn't exactly something that our society looks at and says, hey, you should really examine that and fix it. We're really discouraged to critique ourselves, to critique our thoughts, right? And when we do start to do that, or we say that somebody else should be doing that, that's where our defense mechanisms comes up, and we say, no, I'm fine, everything's fine, I don't need to be doing that, I'm perfect, right? It hasn't been socialized for us to do that, to self-examine in this way. It's uncomfortable, but we have to do it. It's a necessity. So we have to think about our nonverbal behaviors. We have to think about how this comes through in assessments. We have to think about how this comes through and how we're interpreting discourse within our clients. And a lot of this goes back to the cultural aspects of assessments and how, again, we come from the assessments were developed based on white males, essentially, primarily, and so they don't translate over to every other culture, and they don't necessarily translate into this day and age even. If you think about some of the career assessments you'll learn about this summer, a lot of them really are archaic, to be frank. And so we have to think about a person's identity or the multiple ways that they identify, and how our verbal and nonverbal and unconscious behaviors can be modified. So if we're thinking about systematic oppression and privilege in the different groups, if we're thinking again about the larger umbrella of social justice issues, we're incorporating all the isms: racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, and all the others: ageism, religion, language, region that somebody grows up in. So it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot. You'd be hard-pressed to find a client that wasn't shaped or influenced by feeling one way or another that they have been oppressed or marginalized simply because their existence in one of these classes of individuals. So when we think of rehabilitation counseling and we think about the heart of the work that we do, what the literature says, what the research says, is that rehab counselors have always looked at attitudinal and environmental barriers. We've always done that. We've always addressed that in rehab counseling because we work with people with disabilities. And people with disabilities, if we're looking at the large group of everybody that identifies as somebody with a disability, any disability, but all of them, it's the largest marginalized group that there is, really, because it's collectively made up of individuals that identify in other ways as well. But yet it's not talked about in every textbook. So we also, as a profession, have promoted activism. We've worked with our clients and for our clients to seek out change in policy, to develop and pursue and push laws into place that didn't exist, that protect individuals with disabilities. We promote equality for people with disabilities. So there's always been this awareness and promotion of what are really social justice competence standards, but we've never really framed it in that way. Like to me, the profession of rehab counseling screams social justice, but if you look at kind of how we view ourselves, rehab counselors aren't really the first to say, yeah, I'm a proponent of social justice advocacy, and I feel like I'm a social justice oriented counselor, but really we are, the literature just doesn't reflect that. It's still kind of overly focused on multicultural competence because there's still work to be done in those areas. Even in rehab counseling literature and research has been done, there are still differences in return to work outcomes, as you're going to find through some of the readings you'll do. There's still differences in return to work outcomes dependent on somebody's how they identify, whether it's racial identity, gender identity. Essentially, rehab counselors have biases that exist, and so we may be placing women, for example, in lower paying career tracks, or putting them in what society has told us women should do: the teacher jobs, the counselor jobs, the nursing positions, rather than looking at the more male oriented jobs that pay more, the manufacturing type jobs, the financial type jobs. So rehab counselors, still there are discrepancies, even though we promote social justice, of course. So when we're thinking about culturally appropriate treatment, I've kind of gone over all of this in one way or another, but I do encourage you to really look at the points that I'm trying to make on slide 8, that we have to continuously develop competence, and we have to look at the type of treatment that's being utilized within the agencies that we're working in, within our private practice, and the theoretical orientations that we're subscribing to, and how even those theoretical orientations, the history of those, how theorists that developed those orientations, those, the ones that we read about in the textbook, how they viewed people from other cultures and from other marginalized groups, how they were treated. We need to think even in the context of the DSM. The DSM itself was conceptualized way back when on the medical model. In a number of different ways, it still is clearly rooted in that, in that there are categories and symptoms that are basically put out there and seemingly making it look like there's a universal set of symptoms that one individual may exhibit in order to have, a diagnosis. That's one particular diagnosis. The DSM also kind of assumes that there's normal or abnormal, that you're either in a DSM category, you either have a diagnosis or you don't. There's no fluidity there. So it's important to, again, I don't think the DSM is going away, and I don't think insurance companies are ever going to get away from that and the ICD codes, but we as counselors in the work that we do can understand that that is one facet of the overall picture that we have of our client. So moving on to women with disabilities here, and I'm going to go ahead and just pause it and pick up on this so you guys can take a break, and we're not going to exhaust you fully, but so come back.